We have mics to be on this one.
Okay.
We have one for both video systems. This one is, put it under your sweater.
Where do you want it? You can put it on.
Okay, you can go under the sweater.
Yeah. Another mic? Sure. Gosh, I'm getting wired here.
I'm wearing it right now. Let's see. Put this right here.
I'm gonna stand. Is it long enough for me to stand?
Not sure.
You're blocking your view.
It's about the length of it.
Okay. Well.
I think we have another one, if you can believe that.
No, I can't.
I didn't realize it was the one for that. A little too clear. Sorry about this.
I'm going to stand up when I talk. This chair is too comfortable. I can't talk sitting in this one. I'm going to have to stand up.
You're spoiling me.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's ready to get set go time here. I just wanted to say, Kriyananda needs no introduction, but I just wanted to say that we at the ranch, and I know all of us are so grateful that he's here with us. And we've had a long association together back in the old days. I think it might be even over 40 years now, or
It's over 40 years.
over 40 years. And we both feel, we're saying today, we both feel younger, but nevertheless, a lot of things have gone by in those 40 years, and I just wanted to say that I'm very proud of Kriyananda. He's done such a tremendous job to further Master's work, because one of the things that Master was so interested in was to start these communities and to bring people together in satsang, or self-realization fellowship. Actually, is what satsang means to me. It means that we are together in the spirit, enjoying the spirit, real devotees and real family, not necessarily our blood and flesh family, but those of us that are going towards God together, and not just going towards God together, but feeling God in each other, loving one another. And this is what his work has been in starting Ananda and all the things that he's done. Even he did a great job in self-realization fellowship when he was there. I was around at the time. We didn't call him Kriyananda in those days. It was Donald Walters. We used to call him Walters. And somehow I still feel that closeness of Walters to me, but that's just that close brotherhood that we've always felt together. And so I'm very proud to have him come and visit us here and be with us for these few days that he's here. And it's a real joy, and it's a real blessing for the ranch. It's just a real blessing to have him here. And it's also a real blessing to have all of you here. I mean, I really feel such a love for all of you, and I'm just really happy that you're here. And so I'm going to just turn this over to you, Swami. Also, I wanted to say one more thing, that you will be here tomorrow, and normally it's my day to do the service, but I reluctantly am turning it over. I thought you wouldn't object.
Well, we'll do it together, I understood.
So anyway.
You know, it's funny, Master had me lecture and Bob lecture, and I think he feels probably the way I always have, which is that I don't really care to lecture. I do it because Master put me in that position, and I ask him to help me to do a good job of it, but I'm just as happy to share it with him. No sacrifice involved. I said to him once, "Sir, I don't want to be a minister." He said, "You'd better learn to like it. That's what you've got to do." So I didn't get much sympathy on that one. Well, what I'd like to do is chant and meditate a bit with you, and then talk a little bit, and then if you would like to ask questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. I think you normally have the practice of writing your questions, but if you have to write your questions, you won't be able to base any of them on what I've been saying, and you might want to ask questions on the basis of what I've said. So I'll just ask you to voice your questions as they occur to you, and then we'll see how it all goes. So let's begin with a prayer and chanting and meditation. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Kriyananda, our Guru, Paramhansa Yogananda ji, saints of all religions, we bow to all of you. Make our souls thy temple. Make our hearts thy altar. Make our love thy home. Be thou the only King. Reigning on the throne of all our desires. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, there we begin. Let's see if this will do. Is that okay?
I think so.
Good, thank you. Sadrisham Tattvamasya Dilaksham Ekam Nityam Vimalamachalam Sarvati Chakshibhutam seeing thee, my Lord, will my days fly away. Without seeing thee, my Lord, night and day, I look for thee, night and day, night and day, I look for thee, night and day. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee, night and day. Night and day, I look for thee, night and day. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee, night and day, I look for thee, night and day. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide, I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Wilt thou come, just for once come to me? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee, night and day. only thee, Lord, thee, only thee. I want 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 only thee, state. I'd like to take this sweater off, which means I'm going to have to take off one of these. It's warm in here. This is better than those mics they used to have, big NBC, CBS with their logo over it and the speaker peeping out from behind the trees.
Put this on the floor in your pocket.
What have I done now? It's going to be a little... That's two of them down, one more to go.
Yeah. You wired up.
What's this tied into, Jeff? What's this tied into? Or is that just remote?
And just put this in my pocket.
Yeah.
Except it's got to go on something.
There we go.
Okay.
Gotcha. I thought I put this on the floor.
Why?
Is it all right?
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Well, it's a privilege also for me and a great joy to be here. For many years I've wanted to visit. My only real regret is that I couldn't be here when Mr. Black was still here. On the other hand, I have the compensating joy of having Bob Raymer here. I have to really hand it to Oliver. His energy was extraordinary. In the last year of his life, he wrote to me asking for suggestions for how to start a community. Here he was, 93, 94. 95. You don't start communities at 95, but it was. It was extraordinary. It's as Bob was saying, it's like old times being together. I came to Master in 48. That was 44 years ago. It seems to probably most of you like a long time. To me, it seems like yesterday. And although I mentioned earlier I always would have liked not to have to lecture, that aspect of my nature is well balanced and compensated for by the fact that I love to share. And what I love to share is his teachings, his philosophy, his vibration, if possible, to the extent that he allows me to be a channel for that. Because he's no longer with us, and yet he's with all of us. To me, his reality is not something that ended on March 7th, 1952, when he left his body. His reality is today. I feel him with me all the time. I see him in many of you. That reality that he brought into the world was not a historic event, although it was also that. It was a new vibration, a new dispensation that will last for a long, long time, perhaps forever on this planet. Just as all the great saints who ever lived are still living. In fact, there's a very interesting example of that that springs to mind of a book that I discovered in India called the Book of Brigu, which is Brigu is an ancient saint. Master tells a story about him in his lessons, about his humility and how through his humility Krishna called him the saint of all saints. In the Bhagavad Gita he's called, among saints I am Brigu. And he wrote a book of prophecies, at least he's supposed to have written them. And a number of people have gone there, including myself, and found things about themselves, very specific names, etc. But one man told me a really interesting story, that he's an Indian who lives in Los Angeles, went back to India and visited this Book of Brigu. And during the reading it said, while this is being read, there will be a thunderclap. And there was absolutely a blue sky. Right at that moment, there was a loud thunderclap. And it makes you think that those saints who lived thousands of years ago, they're just as alive today. They can be just as active in people's lives whenever we come onto this planet in time, because they are beyond time. And that's how Master is, beyond time. One time, Louise Royston, she was an older disciple, looked something like a rabbit, sort of a little fuddy-duddy. Master used to say about all the people who would find freedom, salvation in this life, and he'd look out the window. I remember him at the desert looking out the window and saying, even she. And he said, you know, she was even uglier when she came. It was, you know, he was so human. And yet, so full of love, so kind. In all his dealings, you were dealing with a God-man and a man-God, and you couldn't tell which was which. There was this lovely story, I think I've mentioned it in my book, The Path, of how he went out to a shop. He had a little collection of umbrellas. He used to collect things more to keep his mind down to the body than for anything else. Umbrellas couldn't mean much to him, after all. Somebody who could roam around the astral, but or the universe in God. But he bought this umbrella, and he haggled the man down because he felt, well, he was representing a spiritual work. He should get the best price possible. He should be practical. And so he knocked him down to the best price he possibly could. And then, having gotten this absolute bargain, gave him twice as much money as the man asked for. And the man said, oh, you're a gentleman. And he gave him his best umbrella. And Master came back, and I remember him saying, and he said, that was an awfully poor rug he had in his shop. I think I'll buy him a new rug. But this kind of sweetness that was under all the, after all, he was a conqueror too. He was a man who had to build a great work. He was very, very strong and dynamic, but underneath that, there was this lovely sweetness of nature that pervaded everything that he did. You could always, sometimes he'd have to scold us. I know when he scolded me, I'd look into his eyes, and I'd see that look of regret in his eyes, that if only he didn't have to scold me, but I needed it. It made me feel bad for making him scold me. There was a delightful story of that one of the monks there told me, that he was sitting in a room, this third floor interview room upstairs, and there was a nun sitting at one end of the room, and this monk was sitting at the other end. A room not quite this long, but a fairly large room. And Master was giving this nun a good scolding. And he'd think that he was really angry. But he was only trying to impress this thought on her. And every time he turned his back to her and was facing this monk, he'd break into a smile and wink and then turn back like this. But he had this kind of control that made it possible for him to switch from one to another. Why? Basically because he wasn't even there. That was the other thing that amazed me when I look at him. He wasn't there. He was everywhere. You weren't looking into the eyes of a person with a personality. And when people talk about him and his personality, I realize they haven't really understood. He did have a personality in the sense of something he had to assume. You have to function with something, after all. But it wasn't a personality because there was no personal likes or dislikes. He had no thought that I like this or I like that. Some people like to eat mangoes because the Master loved mangoes. Well, yeah, he loved mangoes, but also he couldn't have cared less about them. He liked everything. What could he not like? I remember asking Ananda Mohima, and I was talking Bengali, and I didn't know quite how to say it. So I wanted to ask if what I had done was pleasing to her in a spiritual sense. And I didn't know how to say pleasing to you, so I said, does it make you happy? She said, I'm always happy. And in fact, that's what you find on the path. The longer you go on the path, the more you find you're always happy and nothing really touches you. And you could be at death's door and you just lie there blissfully feeling happy. And people do things that are unfair, unkind, and in one way you are sorry, but on the other hand, you know it doesn't touch you. You're happy in yourself. That's what this spiritual path is all about. That, I think, is the ultimate guideline to moral judgments. That is to say, whether I'm doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Does it give you inner bliss? Does it facilitate the outpouring of inner bliss? Because nothing can give you bliss, but certain things can impinge on your consciousness to the point where you don't feel bliss anymore. When you say something, have you ever noticed that when people, for example, will say something unkind about somebody, invariably they laugh. Not because it's funny, because they know they've said something they shouldn't have said and they don't feel good about it, and trying to affirm that they feel good anyway, they laugh. They tell a dirty story, they laugh. There's nothing funny about the story. They're trying to affirm a happiness that getting into a lower kind of consciousness, getting into a mean kind of consciousness, a vindictive consciousness, a sensual consciousness, this somehow darkens the mind. And they try to throw it off by laughing about it. Think of all the jokes about people who are drunk. What's funny about getting drunk? Well, admittedly, sometimes it is funny. But usually it's not. The fact of drunkenness isn't funny. The fact of somebody trying to use a corkscrew for a key, for a house key, that may be sort of funny, but it's also pathetic when you realize what people are doing with their lives. And yet people laugh over this. Why? Because again, they're trying to get rid of that sense that I haven't done the right thing by my own true conscience. So the guideline of whether you're doing the right thing or not is whether it gives you bliss, whether it permits you to feel bliss, I should say, because nothing gives it to you, but you have this bliss naturally inside yourself. Sri Yukteswar talked about developing the heart's natural love. He said, until you've developed that natural love of the heart, you can't take one step on the path, not one foot in front of the other. All the learned wisdom that you've read in books and the definitions you can come up with and so on, they don't mean anything if you don't have this love. And if you have the love, that's really all that matters anyway. And so he spoke about this heart's natural love. He didn't say how to acquire love. He spoke of how to allow it to flourish by getting rid of those things that he called the meannesses of the heart. Jealousy, pride of pedigree is one I've always remembered. All these things that make the heart small. And what we want to do is expand our sympathies, expand our consciousness, expand our compassion for other people, to try to understand where they're coming from, what their real reasons are. If you can see people like that, you're beginning to see them the way a master sees them. I read something that I've never read Ernest Holmes, but somebody sent me a book of his, and I opened it up, and the first thing I read was, if you can be for something and against nothing, you're a savior. Now, that's a beautiful thought. If you can be for something you really believe in, but then against nothing, that's what a master is. And that's what I saw Master was. He was never against anything. He was accepting of all. But when he had disciples who came to him for discipline, then he tried to help them, but he wasn't against them as they were. He accepted them. And this kind of view, this makes it worthwhile to study the life of a master, to understand what he was as an example to us. I saw in that in a way there was just nobody there. I remember him telling us one time that whenever I'm about to be reborn in a body and see the personality I'm to assume, it feels like an overcoat on a hot summer day. Uncomfortable, and I get used to it and accept it. But that's not he. I got off the track when I talked of Louise Royston. She told me this story, that after his death, after his Mahasamadhi, he was in the crypt at Forest Lawn, and all the nuns went down to pray there, and most of them were weeping and feeling terrible. Of course you feel terrible when somebody so dear to you dies. But she was standing a little apart. She was saying, after all, he's something much more than that. I feel him in my heart. And then she felt him suddenly standing beside her, And she heard him say, "I'm not in there." Master isn't there, he's here, he's everywhere. The concept of omnipresence is something that is beyond human power to grasp. We're not even omnipresent in this little body. You're not as much as in your toe as you are in your brain. If you were to trace your I-ness back, your ego back to where it really is, it's right here in the medulla oblongata. And everything radiates out from that. That's why that's the only part of the body they can't operate on. That's the source of the life that comes into the body when the body is created. It comes into the brain, down the spine, out the nervous system, and so the whole body forms. When you go out at death, you go out through the medulla oblongata. And if you go out in a positive way, you go out through the reflection of the medulla, which is the spiritual eye. That's the same center, really. If you go out unconsciously, you sink back into the medulla and go out that way. But the omnipresence in this body, it just isn't. You could lose your legs, your arms, just about everything. You'd still be there. A master is omnipresent in the whole universe. It's not conceivable from human terms. To be omnipresent, Master said, is in the autobiography of a yogi. He talks about in the chapter on the heart of a stone image. He said the divine vision is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. A fantastic concept. And yet people are circumference everywhere, center nowhere. Because they see everything from outside. They can't understand a thing except in terms of forms, definitions, dogmas. So a master's personality to them means what the master was. There's no such thing as personality. I remember once in Assisi, Italy, the first time I went there, I went to the Portiuncola, where St. Francis used to live, and I felt his presence. And it was so sweet. So I hadn't imagined that it was possible for human consciousness to be that sweet. And I said, I prayed, how is this possible? And I got a clear answer. By never judging anybody, by being a child, having no judgment, just being open to everyone, being always humble, setting yourself below everyone, but above all, by never judging. And that was the essence also of Master's life. That's why he called St. Francis his patron saint. Because he too, although his life was a very different type, still inside Master had that sweetness, that freedom, that humility. I remember one time, in fact, he just finished writing the interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita, and he was reading a portion of it one night where he said that the soul, when it becomes one with God, becomes God. It isn't that you or I can say, I am God. That would be a fallacy because we're talking from an egoic level. There is no I in God. God is I everywhere. But in that state, you become one with Him and you become Him. You become He, is that right? And this disciple said, well, Master, that means you're God. He said, why do you say you? He is God. Yes, but you're one with Him and therefore you're God. He said, no, He is God. And the disciple kept insisting. He was a Bengali and very sort of strong in his way of expressing. In Calcutta particularly, they loved to talk, and he was very full of talk. And so he kept pushing Master, and he said, well, you've said you're one with God, that when you're one with God, you become God. That means you are God. And Master said, well, he who says he is, isn't, and he who says he isn't, isn't. He left it at that. And then the disciple said, well, that's just your humility, sir, that we all find so inspiring. Master's answer was, how can there be humility when there's no consciousness of self? So he would always take simple little conversations even. This was not a simple conversation, but he'd take the most simple one and turn it to where suddenly you were seeing a vast vista of truth. And living with him, I remember one time he was talking about potholes that needed to be filled in the driveway. Well, that's as mundane a topic as you can get into. And I wasn't a part of that particular project, so I was just sitting there. And I just felt this freedom. It was just as if the top of my head had come off, and I was just sort of expanding in that freedom. And I realized that that's what he really was. It's like a beautiful story of Ramakrishna, who, as you possibly know, died of throat cancer. And a close disciple of his was feeling such compassion. He was talking about, he came to him and he said, "How do you feel, Master?" And the Master said, "Well, I feel terrible." And he started describing all the ravages that this disease was having. It's one of the most painful forms of disease you can have. And the disciple, you would expect, would have been just practically melting with pity. Instead, he was feeling more and more joyful. Finally, he said, "Master, don't say any more. I know what you're really feeling." And that's how Master was. He was not touched by anything. He was always in that bliss. Being with him, you had to watch it though. He didn't put it out. You had to tune into it. He didn't go around with M for Master on his T-shirt. It was something that you had to sort of catch. And even the miracles that he performed, he never did said, "Lo, I do such and such," but around him things happened. I remember this episode, I think I've mentioned this also in the path, how a brother disciple and I were plastering a garage. Well, he did the plastering and I did the mixing of the mud. And this plaster was it must have been very old, because it would set up before we could get it on the wall. And I had to keep pouring water onto it and working it to keep it soft so that he could keep using it. I had just poured a fresh batch when Master drove up and stopped the car. He had the car stopped. He wasn't driving, and had the car stopped and called us over. Well, of course, I was delighted to talk to him, and he talked at least a half an hour. But in the back of my mind there was this anxiety that I'd need a hammer and chisel to get that stuff off the board. Well, you know, when I came back, it was completely soft. After half an hour, and we had no more trouble with it the rest of the day. He didn't say anything. It just was normal to him. Of course, it was normal. I mean, if he's one with the person who created the universe, what's a bit of plaster on a board? But there was no effort to call attention to the fact that he'd done it, to the point where we thought, well, is it coincidence? Once might be a coincidence, but these things keep happening. You begin to realize there's a common denominator at work there. He was also very aware, as he is still. He used to say, "I know every thought you're thinking." Well, I can imagine somebody at Duke University sort of becoming a really super psychic and sitting behind this opaque board while somebody else is looking at cards and telling you which card it is and coming up right each time. That would make headlines. Master with hundreds of disciples, thousands possibly, and knowing what every one of them was thinking all the time, this is a little beyond conception. But he proved it to me too many times for comfort. He was always very strong on trying to make me accept being a minister and being in charge. He had me in charge of the monks, and I always wanted to be sort of at the back. Whenever there was a group of us, I'd always stand at the back or sit at the back so that I could just meditate on his vibrations. And he'd always sort of zero in on me and look at me when he was talking, so I had to keep my eyes open. And the same thing in work and in position. I was in charge of the monks, but I felt that being in charge makes you a servant, not a boss. I remember in Encinitas one time, Dr. Lewis, we were leaving, and we were leaving in a van, and Dr. Lewis was saying goodbye. And he said, I was in the back of the van. He said, you should be up front. I said, why? He said, because you're in charge. I said, that's why I should be in the back. And that's the way I used to feel. So one time I said to him, because he called me actually Walter, not Walters, but my name is Walters. And so I said, do you want people to call me Don or Walter? He said they should call you Reverend Walter. Well, here, boys my own age and much older than I felt a bit awkward, so I changed the subject. But he was always trying to get me to accept that kind of position. And so as a minister and so on, he was watchful that I say the right thing and not and I was altogether too casual. So one time somebody at the Hollywood church, who was just somebody who came, he was not a member or anything particularly, and he said, who's going to be giving the class next Thursday? And I said, well, I am. And he said, oh, I'll be sure to come then. And I knew that it was just flattery. I knew it didn't mean anything to him. He'd have come anyway or he wouldn't have come, but I was absolutely certain he wouldn't come because I was there. And so I said, well, be sure to check people's pockets for vegetables. And it wasn't a very dignified thing to say. When I saw Master the next day, I used to serve him when he had guests and then perform the yoga postures and so on. And after the guest had departed, he said, that wasn't a very dignified thing to say, talking about vegetables. Don't talk like that. Well, you can be sure this man, who was really an outsider, hadn't told anybody. But Master knew. One time I said something at some function about Master's miraculous powers, and it was to a group of very skeptical doctors. And it was a bar mitzvah, and all these doctors were very Beverly Hills types, you know. And I told him to convince him in his skepticism about some miracle Master had performed that I'd seen. And Master later said to me, you shouldn't talk about those things because they don't understand. But he was up on everything I said. Embarrassing. Sometimes I'd have a little thought in my meditation. One time I used to pray to him, teach me to love you the way you love me. And he looked at me when we were a little group together in the main office there, and he said, the wave can't understand what the ocean feels. Meaning, how can you, the wave, what was he saying? No, it was more than that. It was, the wave can't hold, the cup, that was it, the cup can't hold the whole ocean. How could I, with my little human heart, hold the kind of love that he felt, being one with the whole universe of love, with the Lord himself? But I remember one time leaving the room, and he was just saying goodbye. I was at the door. Well, I've always been quite nearsighted, so that I can see you, and if it's somebody I know well, I'll know who it is, but I can't see the expressions without my glasses on. I didn't have my glasses on. And so I couldn't see his expression. It had nothing to do with any sweetness in his expression or anything like that. But the power of love that just overwhelmed me was so great I could hardly get out of the room. That magnetism, that's what was real. That consciousness, that's what's real. And we can talk about those days and talk with nostalgia about those days, but I think that it's much more important to see how the tree has grown and talk about how it can grow further. We've got to live right now. We've got to realize that that same power is with you. I said to him, will you be as much with us as in the future after you leave your body as you are now? And he said, to those who think me near, I will be near. He put emphasis on the word think. Feel his presence, and you'll be amazed at how real he can become for you. There's another thing that I learned. Because as a minister, I always thought that my job was to introduce people to Master and then sort of wash my hands of them. Now they belong to him. He's going to take care of them. But I discovered over the years that it doesn't work like that. That those people who have contact with disciples, or with people who have been trained by disciples, because this line just has to keep going. It's like a relay race. You have to keep passing the baton to people. But those who are, like, you've been very fortunate to have Mr. Black here. Master used to speak so highly of him. He thought very highly of Bob. And to have this kind of direct contact, I've seen that it's much more valuable than just living on your own and having that contact there. Why should that be? Because the Master is also alive in the line of disciples that he created, and in those who come and study with them and so on. It's something that gets passed on down through the ages. We, and that means you too, have to keep it alive. It's not enough to be passive as a devotee. You've got to serve as an instrument. And the more you can serve, the better. There was a center leader up in Montreal, Canada, and he was very good, Adano Lee, I guess he pronounced it. And Master was wanting somebody at Mount Washington for a particular work there. And I suggested that we invite Adano Lee, the center leader up there, to come to Mount Washington to do this work, because I thought he'd be good for it. I said, he's doing a good work up in Montreal. Master's answer quite surprised me. He said, if he's doing a good work there, why take him from there? It doesn't matter where we are, but that we have that inner attunement and that we serve, that we act as instruments. There was a surprising letter that I read. The uncle of one of our members at Ananda, her name is Anandi, I gave her that name, and her uncle knew Master back in the 20s. He was a lot older than she. And in this letter he was saying, he was urging him to help the center and help the work in an outward way, help it financially. He said, this will not only help the work, but it will mean your salvation. And I'd always had this dividing line between outward work and the inner spiritual work. I didn't quite see that the two came together. And the thought that helping financially will also mean your salvation was a new idea to me, but Master expressed that if we serve as instruments in any way that we can, if you can support the work here in any way that you can, if you can come and live here, all the better, to live with other devotees, to be with people who are on the path, people who can help you in different ways by their example, lift you when you're feeling down. All these are reasons why I started Ananda. And I had dreamed of starting a community back when I was 15, so I came to Master with that idea already firmly placed in my heart, that desire to start one. And at 15, of course, I was able to get my friends enthusiastic about it until they found I was serious, and of course they all dropped off. But I was serious, and when I found out that this was Master's dream too, then I really locked into it. I was telling them the other day, yesterday, or 2 days ago at evening, no, yesterday it was, how when you read these things in books, you don't get the whole picture. I remember I was giving a service at Ananda, and one of the people there was reading a passage from The Path, where Master was talking in Beverly Hills about starting communities everywhere. And she was reading, and you all must go north, south, east, west, everywhere to spread this idea. Well, that may be the way he comes across in writing, but I said, give me that book. I said, you want to hear how he said it? He said, go north, south, east, west, everywhere! And he talked with such power, I was just thrilled to. He talked with power, and he talked with joy. When he told a joke, you probably couldn't understand what it was all about, because his accent was pretty thick, and when he told a joke, it got thicker. But it was so funny anyway, you were practically rolling in the aisles. He had a great sense of humor. He loved a couple of Scottish jokes that he heard when he went to Scotland. He'd tell them often. There was these three people, each with a glass of whiskey, and a fly fell into each of them. There was an Irishman, a Scotchman, and an Englishman. And the Irishman just sort of sloshed his glass, half the whiskey went out along with the fly, and he drank the rest. And the Englishman very carefully flicked the fly out, and the Scotchman squeezed the fly. Another he left to tell was these 3 Scotchmen who went to church, and when the collection basket started coming their way, one of them fainted and the other 2 carried him out. But he would laugh, and when he laughed, his whole heart was in it. He had a great sense of humor and a lovely way of putting things to bring out the absurd. But then the other side of it was that he was in absolute control. When you tell jokes, people get into a jolly mood and they're all wanting to tell more. He could just change it in a moment. Nothing could make him laugh anymore. He was then talking about truth. And he would talk from this high level that, well, I remember, this is a story I told yesterday too. One time one of the monks wrote him a note saying, "Whenever I look at you, I see Divine Mother." Well, you can imagine how you'd expect him to react. "Oh no, don't say that, I'm only, like that." After all, he's humble, right? He took his little cane and tapped this boy on the knee and he said, "Then behave accordingly." He was that. There was no need to waffle and whiffle and skirt around the issue. That's what he was. He wasn't this man in front of us. And this infinite consciousness is with us today. It's with you. One of the greatest inspirations I've had in teaching, because I've never liked the idea of talking down to people, but sharing is beautiful, and this inspiration came to me to feel that everybody in the audience is master. And somebody said to me, and sort of objecting to that, "Well, you don't want to lecture to your guru, do you?" I said, that's not what it is. But he's in there. The divine is in each person. And if anything that Master can inspire me to say or do or whatever can bring that awake, then that's the Master I'm talking to, not the personality. He used to talk to us that way. He never talked to the personality. I'll never forget an occasion when he had me, well, back in those days I was about the only person you'd see anywhere with a beard. I remember going through the streets of Los Angeles once and somebody shouting out, "Fidel Castro!" And it just was an unusual event to see somebody with a beard. And so somebody thought I looked like Jesus. Naturally, I had a beard, Jesus had a beard, we had to look alike. So they had a Masonic investiture, is that the word, of officers, and they wanted me to go there and be in a tableau as Jesus at Gethsemane. And it wasn't a hard thing to do. Sometimes I had to sit up and look into the sky, and the other time I had to sort of lean heavily on the rock and look as if I was unhappy, and that was sort of the big deal. And it turned out to be a disaster, the whole thing, because they had a big fight. Half the people got up and walked out. It was all pre-planned. 2 things beautiful came out of that. One was Master said, "How did it go?" And I said, "Well," and he said, "It was a disaster, wasn't it?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Don't say anything." Now, why should I not say anything? I'm saying it to you, but I'm saying it for a positive purpose now. He didn't want us to talk about negative things. What happened to that Masonic order group didn't mean anything to us personally, but it was a negative thing. Why talk about it? Why not talk about beauty? Why not talk about good things that happen? The other thing was this, that he said some of the people thought you really looked like Jesus up there with your, I didn't say with your beard, but I guess that's why they thought that. Anyway, I said, well, what I'd rather be is, I'd rather be like him than look like him. And his comment was not at all the kind of deprecatory humor I expected. He said, well, that will come. You see, he saw God in each one of us. He saw our potential. He never accepted anything less than that potential. And he could look at the worst person. I remember this one event where there was this drunk at a function, he was an Indian, and he was being very familiar with Master, sort of throwing his arms around him like this. And this Bengali said something to Master in Bengali jokingly, and Master said, "Don't." To him, this was a soul. This was a perfect being acting imperfectly, but still he had that quality. And he always was in talking with people, he always had that graciousness, that respect, that made you feel that he was in the presence of God wherever he went. Even when somebody got into a theological argument with him, trying to insist that he was wrong and following his way, and Master said, "Well, you can't take everything literally that's in the Bible." The man said, "Yes, everything." Master said, "Well, what about in the Garden of Eden, the serpent talking? Serpents don't talk." And the man said, "Well, in those days, serpents did talk." Master took off his hat. In those days, men wore hats, and he took off his hat. He said, "I bow to the temple of colossal ignorance that I behold before me." But even that was with respect. It was done to sort of shake this guy up a little bit and help him to understand. And he could be strong, too. There was this event on the train where some Orthodox preacher saw him dressed in an orange robe. He was going to a lecture. Normally he didn't dress in his robes in America. But this time he was going to a lecture, so he did. And this man got very upset, and he got up in front of this long train load full of people, carload full of people, and he said, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" "Yes." "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your only Savior?" "I accept God as my Savior, and He has effected His salvation through many, including Jesus." "Unless you accept Jesus Christ as your only Savior, you will go to hell!" And his face was contorted with anger. Well, you know, if there's any hell in this world, it's harmful emotions like anger. So Master, with a pleasant smile, said, "Well, I may get there by and by, but my friend, you're there already." So he had that respect, but that didn't make him blind, and that didn't keep him from being strong sometimes, too, in his reply. But it was always done to shake people up, to help them. It was never done to get even, to come out on top, to put people down. Never like that. Even in his scolding, there was always that kind of respect. He was a gentleman, but in a divine way. He saw the best in people. Now, how do you translate that into where you are right now? Because that's important. What he did 40 years ago is one thing, and it's beautiful to think about. But what does it mean to you today? Well, this particular thing means don't feel guilty about what you do wrong. Realize that you have within you a sleeping God. And sooner or later, it's got to come out. That's the one thing you can't get away from, is your true self. You can get away from many false selves, including all the mistakes you make. You can't get away from your true self. You can take a few million lifetimes if you want finding it, but that's who you are. You are not anything else. You are a spark of the infinite Brahman, the infinite Spirit. And if you can live always in this, the way Master held up before us, always that image of our potential, our ingrained, if dormant, perfection. That doesn't mean to make mistakes and say, well, they aren't mistakes. Because you'll suffer in this world of delusion for the mistakes that you make. But on the other hand, if you give God the blame, just make Him responsible. Master said He likes that. He likes it because the more you can make Him responsible, the more you open yourself to Him, to the point where He can begin to do good things through you instead of making these blunders that you sort of impose by getting in the way of that inspiration. So don't feel guilty, but remember what Master said. A saint is a sinner who never gave up. No matter how many times you fail. I had a really interesting experience this way many years ago, before I came on the spiritual path, I should say consciously, because we're all on the path whether we know it or not, but we don't all know it yet. And I wanted to give up smoking. Well, I tried. It was like Mark Twain, who said that he'd found it the easiest habit in the world to give up. He said, I've done it 1,000 times. And so I would give it up in the morning and take it up again in the evening. I didn't mind not smoking much of the time, but that smoke with a little coffee after a meal, I liked it, and so I'd get back to it. And each time I'd go back, there are two ways you can react. Here's the way most people react when they set themselves a goal and fail. They say, oh, damn it, I blew it again. Oh, I'm no good. I don't have any willpower. I'm weak. Every failure becomes an affirmation of failure. So they become weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, maybe through good karma, maybe through some divine influence, maybe by sheer luck, I came on the other alternative. What I said each time I failed was, I haven't yet succeeded. That's what a painter does. If he puts a wrong stroke on a canvas, he doesn't say, oh, I blew it again. He says, wait a minute, that's not quite right. Let's try another color. Let's try making the line go a little bit differently. Isn't that so? Well, after a year of this, still having to affirm I haven't yet succeeded, I remember one night going to bed and just knowing that from then on I wasn't going to smoke. And I mentioned to a roommate of mine that I'm not going to smoke anymore. And he said, oh yeah, I've heard that one before. Well, I was really serious. I wouldn't allow him to kid me on the subject. I knew I was saying the truth. And that thought also went down into the subconscious as I went to sleep, and I carried it there. That influenced my habit patterns. And I carried around a half-open, half-empty package of cigarettes in my breast pocket for a couple of weeks, giving them out to friends. I had no desire again. The only weakness I ever had was about 2 months later I dreamed that I'd smoked. And never again. Came from simply affirming, I haven't yet succeeded. Don't affirm guilt. Don't affirm weakness. Don't accept. This is what Master kept telling us. Don't accept that you are in delusion. Don't accept that you're anything less than Christ himself. Don't go around saying, look, I'm Christ. Bow down to me. No, you're not at that place yet. But you have that spark. The acorn can say, I'm a tree. I just haven't grown yet. You can do that. I'm a tree. I'm a saint. I'm a master. I just haven't reached there yet. But live in that thought that you have God right now. So many people, and Master used to find this exasperating, they keep saying, when will I have God? When will I have God? He said, you have Him! Live in that thought now! He said, I'm tired of hearing all these Indians saying, it's my karma, it's my karma. You don't have karma if you choose not to. Live in the thought that you are free. And that's the other guideline for right action, that which will make you, or make you able to feel your inner bliss. The other is that which will make you to feel free, make you able to feel your inner freedom. Don't allow anything to impose itself on that thought that you are free, even now, even though you're bound, shackled. The prisoner who believes in and dreams of freedom is the one who finally becomes free. Whatever you dream, whatever you wish, whatever you hold strongly in your mind must come to pass. It can't fail. One time Master sort of horrified me, I must say. He said that every desire has to be fulfilled. And I thought, my God, every desire? I said, sir, even a desire I may have had at 19 years old for an ice cream cone, I thought I'd got him there. I thought he'd say, no, not that. He said, oh, yes. With a lot of emphasis. Wow. And you think of all the desires you've had in this life, and you want to know how many lives you've been around? Maybe you better not talk about it. People say, oh, I've been on this planet 2 or 3 times before this. Yeah. There's a story in the scriptures about a large lake. And once every 5,000 years, a bird comes and takes away 1 drop of water from that lake. Assuming that nothing else dries that lake, just that 1 drop of water every 5,000 years. He said the length of time it would take that bird to empty that lake doesn't begin to describe the length of time it takes the soul, once manifested, to merge back into the infinite. Now that is a scary thought. And yet, and we've reached the point, I think we've gone a little bit beyond this. One person who came up to a friend of mine gleefully, who had been studying reincarnation, she said, "Guess what? We get to come back!" Master talked about how he reached the point where it assumes a certain anguishing monotony. You begin to think of going through all those stages of a puking baby, crawling, all the follies of youth. Well, what to speak of the follies of youth, all the follies of all this human life and the mistakes we can make, the ways in which we can get into further trouble, further mischief, the way we can drag it out with those different karmas. It's just not worth it. You begin to think of seeing the same old sky up there and walking on the same old earth and going through the same old thing, having to feed this body day after day and give it its few hours of sleep at night, and all these things. You begin to think, surely there's something more. And you begin to get a little desperate. And you think, I've just got to have God. I know when I met Master, I was so desperate to find God after all this seeking I'd been doing for truth and not getting anywhere, and thinking I'd find it in science and poetry and art, and I wanted to be a playwright, and maybe through politics and all the different things people look for truth in, and realizing that they're all dead ends and there's just nowhere to go except that one. I was so desperate when I met him. When we reach that point, then we're drawn to a guru. When we reach that point, then we're drawn to seek that truth. Norman said to Master once, "I don't think I have very good karma, Master." Master looked at him very strongly. He said, "Remember this. It takes very, very, very good karma even to want to know God." So don't put yourselves down, because he said that just as the desire for an ice cream cone has to be fulfilled, once you've got that desire for God, that too has to be fulfilled. And that's the other side of it. You see, this is nothing but darkness anyway. He said you can't get rid of darkness in a room by beating at it with a stick. Turn the light on. So he said, don't worry about all the things that you've got to overcome, all the things you've got to do in order to grow. Just love God. Love God more deeply. Seek God more deeply, and suddenly you'll find that it's the most natural thing in the world. The saints are at home in that. In fact, they're the only ones who are at home. We're not really at home here. And so we think, how could I ever be like that? How could I ever be omnipresent? How could I ever be wise? How could I ever have this absolute love? I remember the minister of my mother's church. I went to church with her one Sunday, and he was talking about the heroism of the saints. That they love not only Mrs. Green next door, who dumps her garbage over the fence, but also Mr. Brown next door, who lets his dog run over the garden bed, and also Tom Jones across the way, whose children make a lot of noise, and so on and on. He went about the heroism of a saint who loves this one and this one and that one, loving everybody like this. It isn't like that at all. You don't have to, there's no effort involved in being good. Once you're in God, you effortlessly love everybody. You couldn't do anything else. You don't have to think of this path as a big sweat, a big strain to get where you're trying to get. All you have to do is love Him more deeply, and you suddenly find these things happening automatically. You find you don't have to affirm goodness. You are good. You don't have to affirm kindness. You couldn't be anything but kind. You don't have to affirm joy. You're just joyful. He does it all for you. Your job is simply to think of Him more. It's not a big job. Think of God, meditate, act for Him, do things for Him without thinking of what He's going to give to you. Action without desire for the fruits, nishkam karma as they call it in Sanskrit. You live just a few little rules, but live them seriously. And suddenly you find that your life is changing in a way that you couldn't imagine. And every day it changes more. It's not at all like a huge desert you trudge over hoping you don't die of thirst to reach that oasis that for a long time is a mirage, and finally maybe you get there. Not at all. The farther you walk, the more the desert blooms. The farther you walk, the more happy you become in this path. The farther you walk, the more the rewards. The inner joy that you feel, the inner love, the friendships that you form, the little ways in which God takes care of you, they're just incredible. Just the littlest things. I remember years ago, I felt I hadn't been allowed to go back to India. When I left India in 1962, I was thwarted from going back. Somebody reported me to the government. This is how I learned later. And they wouldn't give me a visa. Somebody reported me as a Christian missionary in disguise and a CIA agent. Well, it was all Divine Mother's way of keeping me in America so I could get certain things done, because otherwise I'd have just rushed over there and stayed with Ananda Ma and just forgotten it all. But I wasn't allowed to do that. And so for 10 years I couldn't go. Then finally I felt Divine Mother wanted me to go, so I wrote to them and I said, look, I'd be happy just at my own expense to come there and talk to the Home Ministry and explain what I've done, and you decide then whether you want to give me a visa or not. And actually the obstacles all just melted away as if they'd never existed. The time had passed and God allowed me to go back. But I felt that Divine Mother wanted me to go. Well, I didn't have money at that time. I had to build Ananda with my own work by giving classes everywhere and so on. I had to raise the money. I didn't have wealthy backers. But all the money I made, I had to also keep giving to Ananda to keep it going in the early years. And so, but I took a little bit from classes, and then some people helped me out to go to India. And just 2 weeks before I was to leave, I was in San Francisco, and I don't know much about cars. To me, a car is a magical instrument. You propitiate it by turning the key, and if the motor is pleased, it turns over, and you're able to drive the thing. But anyway, something went very bad with it. I think a rod was broken or something or other. Is that the right terminology? Anyway, what happened was that I had to get rid of this clunker. And I didn't know what to do, because I had the money for the trip to India, but I didn't have any money to buy a car. So I was sort of asking Divine Mother, what shall I do? Shall I buy a car? Because if I can't stay in India, when I come back, I'm certainly going to need a car living up there in the mountains the way I do. And yet I feel you want me to go to India. I didn't get any answers. She just remained quiet. So I put it to her like this. I said, well, Divine Mother, my common sense tells me I have to have a car. If you still want me to go to India, you're going to have to reimburse me. So I traded the car in. I put $1,100. In those days it cost a lot less to go to India, and I put $1,100 down on the car, and yeah, that's how much it was. And so with that I was able to get a decent second-hand car. This was Friday evening, and I went back to Ananda with this new car. Monday morning, from a complete stranger, I'd never heard of him, I got a check in the mail for $1,000, addressed not to Ananda, but to me personally. Normally it would be addressed to Ananda. And a letter in it said, use this as Divine Mother wants you to. Well, in this country, who uses the term Divine Mother? I do, but who knows it? I don't go around blaring it everywhere. And this person didn't know me anyway. How would he? It was such a perfect answer. I've seen things like that happen all the time. One time, years ago, I finished the lessons, the correspondence course that I was writing. And whenever I finish a major job, I like to go off and celebrate with Divine Mother. So I decided I'd go to Carmel. And I didn't take into account that this was August and the height of the tourist season. I got to Carmel, and the place was completely booked. I didn't know what to do. I certainly didn't want to go to Salinas to celebrate with Divine Mother. It seemed like that would be too much of a step downward, and I said, Divine Mother, help me out here. And I found that there was one room in the whole town that was available. And so I went there, and I started to, I asked him how much it was, and well, it was steep for me at that time. I just thought, well, Divine Mother, you're just going to have to see to it that I have enough money to get home, because I've come here to celebrate with you. I'm going to celebrate. So I decided I better pay then, lest I not have the money the next day. So I pulled out my wallet and started to pay, and he said, no, don't pay me. I said, well, I'd rather pay you now. He said, no, don't pay me at all. I said, why? He said, I don't know, I just like you. So I'll write it down. I'll write you down as a travel agent. Why? I didn't know the guy from Adam. How many times has that happened to you? I'll tell you how many times it's happened to me. Once. The next day I was in a restaurant, and somebody came over. He'd heard me lecture in Davis, and he sat down, and he was the owner of the restaurant. And after the meal, he wouldn't let me pay. So I got a free lunch and a free room, and got back to Ananda with just about the same money I'd left it. All because I was doing this with Divine Mother. Now, I think that's the essence of prayer. That we do things with Master, with Divine Mother, not for them. That we bring them into partnership with us. And you find that things just keep happening in wonderful ways. I remember I was up on the Skyline Drive above, south of San Francisco. Suddenly the motor, cluck, cluck, cluck. I looked down at the gas gauge, it was empty. I thought, oh no, I'm from miles from everywhere. Just there, then there was an exit. So I turned off the exit. Fortunately, it was a downhill slope. So I went down this downhill slope and saw a gas station after a while, and pulled into the gas station, just stopped right at the pump. Car wouldn't go any further. But you will see, that's no big deal. Divine Mother can do anything. But the other side of it is that it's fun. It's fun living with God. It's fun sharing things with Him. You just know that He's your friend. You know that He cares for you. You know that He wants... I had this lovely experience back, when I was still at Mount Washington. I think Master may have left by then. I think so. It was probably 1955. Anyway, my parents were... my father was stationed in Bordeaux, France. He worked for Esso as a geologist. And I had grown up in Europe, as probably many of you know, and I'd gone to school in Switzerland, and I remembered Swiss chocolate. And I kept thinking, mind you, this was a very minor desire, but I kept thinking how nice it would be, since they're living in France, if they could get me some Swiss chocolate. And it was such a minor desire that I never remembered even to mention it when I wrote to them, which wasn't all that often, I have to admit. But anyway, the once every 2 months letter that I wrote, I never remembered to mention it. Until suddenly my birthday came around, and I thought, oh, what a pity that I didn't ask them. It would have been made a nice birthday present. Well, if I just said it like that, it would have just remained a pity. But I said, Divine Mother, what a pity. Just sharing it with her. On my birthday, mind you, in those days you didn't see Swiss chocolate anywhere. It's become popular in this country, but then it didn't exist hardly at all. I got a little package from a member of our church who didn't know it was my birthday, didn't know that I liked Swiss chocolates, wrote in a letter saying that I was just passing a store and I saw these Swiss chocolates and thought of you and wanted to share it with you. Got these. And they came for my birthday. And I thought, well, you know, you sort of expect it that Divine Mother will save your life if she needs you to do a work. But to give you chocolates that don't even matter, that's even more a demonstration of love, isn't it? You find this kind of sweetness, that God takes care of you in small ways as well as in great. And there's always that hand behind it. So that even when things come to you that are painful, because mind you, you don't grow only through sweetness, you go through pain. And I've had some hard knocks. Everybody, of course, has the hardest knocks anybody can possibly have. And so I'm not going to say that, but I'll think it. I remember when I had a really hard test back in 1962, And Anandamoyi Ma sent me the message, take this as your Guru's grace. I thought, I can't take that one as grace. But I found out that it was just that. That the hard tests we have are just as much for our good as anything else, and just as much a sign of love and of grace. If you have faith, and if you give every action to God, I mean by that every footstep, you'll find Him taking care of you. Now I'll tell you something else that I've found. That whenever I haven't felt right, whenever my sadhana hasn't gone well, whenever I haven't felt happy in myself, I've always realized it was because of one thing. I wasn't thinking of God and Guru. And as soon as I started thinking again that way, everything started to flow. To be in tune, to surrender your will. These are not easy things, and yet they're the easiest thing in the world. They're not easy because they take willpower. They're the easiest thing in the world because they're the only thing that gives you joy. And if you can live in that thought of, I do everything for you, and all my life I don't have any desires. People say, well, how can I give up my personality? I remember a lovely story of a woman saint in India. Her name was Lala Yogeshwari. And it's unusual for saints in India to wear no clothes, but sometimes those up in the mountains just don't bother. And they call them sky-clad. But it's even more unusual for women to go around with nothing on. And some of the villagers were scandalized with this, and they said, why don't you wear clothes? She said, why should I? I don't see any men around. To her, nobody was fit to be called a man who hadn't realized his potential as a human being. One day there was a great male saint who was coming to visit her, and suddenly a man was coming, and she rushed around to get clothes to put on, because before him he was a human being, he was a man. We aren't even men, women. We haven't explored our potential as human beings. We're still animals until we've found that. That's what we're here for. And to think that that's not what you are and you have to attain it is the greatest mistake you can make. This is what you aren't. This isn't where you are. These aren't the personality traits you've developed, the skills you have. Don't ever think that anything that you do is a credit to you. Give the credit to Him. You'll lose out on that nice feeling of, oh, everybody thinks I'm good at this. What kind of a nice feeling is it? You suddenly wake up and realize it's imprisoned you. The more you think that way, the smaller you become. A girl who's beautiful and uses her beauty as a power over other people sort of feels pleased that, oh, I've got this power over them. Till finally she begins to realize it's made her smaller and smaller and smaller, and she begins to resent the very people she can most influence. But what she's really resenting is herself. We have encaged ourselves with our delusions, our pettiness, our ego. You will only find freedom when you can get rid of that thought of I. When you can get rid of that thought that I am the doer, that I am capable of things, that I have something to contribute. That doesn't mean you stop contributing. You don't get out of karma by not acting. But you act, first of all, by giving the fruits of your actions to God, that I do it for you, not for myself. Second, you act in the thought that God is doing it through me. I remember this lovely thing. Master, toward the end of his life, took the karma of his disciples, and his body was affected by it. We were helping him into the car. And he said, you all are so sweet to me with your many attentions. And we said, oh, sir, it's you who are kind to us. And he smiled so sweetly. He said, God is helping God. That's his drama. It's all God doing everything. He writes the script. He acts the parts. He's the applauding audience. He's everything. Live in that thought. Live in the thought that you are a Mahayogi, a great yogi right now. I remember, however, and this is one of the mistakes that people make, they sort of ask God to do it all for them. I remember we were talking on the way over here this morning. The first house I lived in was a geodesic dome, then I built another one. And this dome is where I live now. But I've expanded it because it's become sort of the spiritual center of our community. And I live downstairs, but it's used for all sorts of classes, meditations and everything. But in the beginning I lived in that dome. And I used to think, Riley, I'm so sincere in trying to stop those leaks, but I'm not forgiven a single hole. I used to think of getting a surfboard to get from one room to the other. It was so bad in the wintertime when I had a trap door, and I'd lift the trap door, there was earth below, and I'd just sweep out maybe 5 gallons of water that all came in through these holes. We finally cured it by putting a roof over the dome. So a cop-out maybe, but at least it worked. Anyway, people are like that, aren't they? That they think, I'm so sincere. Lord, I'm trying. Why do I have to? Why can't I be excused this since I've done this? The fact is, you've got to pay it all in a way. You can't get out from paying your debts. But you'll find a marvelous thing happening. Ramakrishna's wife, Sananda Devi, said that if you're a bhakta, a devotee, and it's your karma to lose a leg, you may just get a scratch. You have to get that, but you may not have to lose the whole leg. Why? Well, what do you do when it rains? You use an umbrella. The same rain falls, but it doesn't touch you. It gets spattered from below. And so when you live in God, you become centered in a great aura of light. This aura that you move in is a protection. So that you find that bad karma, if it's very strong, may get through a little bit, but it doesn't get through with the same power. A little bit can get through, often it won't come through at all, but it'll hit you and you'll feel it a little bit. But if you live in God, that's why it says in the Bhagavad Gita, even a little bit of the practice of this religion will free you from dire fears and colossal sufferings. That the more you live in God, the more you find that you have that protection. It isn't as if He's up in the clouds and said, oh, there's Johnny, he's a devotee, I'm going to help him. You are the one who has to activate the law. You are the one who has to make it happen. He won't do it for you. And that's where this teaching helps to balance. Because many people think that it's all God's grace. We just love God and He does it for us. It doesn't work that way. To some extent, no doubt. But basically, we are the ones who have to activate that law. This is yoga. Master used to say, my own but God-given power. We draw the power from Him. We know it's His power. We use His power. And in our work, we aren't passive. We have to put it into motion, but we have also to feel that it's His power that we are using. And the more we can do that, the more things happen. It's a very subtle line, very hard to understand, even intellectually, what to speak of with experience. If you go, here's the way I put it, and I think this is in keeping with what Master taught, because I always try to put it, everything I say and do, I try to draw from what Master taught and the example he said. I don't try to do something completely different, because I'm his disciple more than anything else. I'm not a teacher, I'm a disciple. But to do it, not you can take one step beyond your present experience, but to do more is presumption. If I were to leap off a building, presuming that God will take care of me, I'll kill myself. Because I haven't had that experience yet of levitating. I haven't had that experience of His helping me in that kind of situation. I haven't developed that kind of power yet, at least I'm not conscious of having done so. So I use what I know and expand on that. Many devotees think, well, a master did that, I can do it. And then they fail, they fall. Master told me the story of these 2 boys who said that if we have faith, a sword won't be able to cut us. It even says in the Gita, fire cannot burn that self, sword cannot cut it, and so on. So they went out into a forest, and one of them took a sword and hit the other and killed him, because their faith was presumption, it wasn't true faith. Master told me that example to show that we have to deal with what we know and a little bit more. But as you grow, your own faith will grow with it, your own power will grow with it. And the more you use that power in God's will rather than just for ego, for show, the more that will expand. Now, the most power that we need is not miraculous power, but the power of love. The power to touch people's hearts. Above all, the power to draw from God His response. That's why we meditate, ultimately. We meditate to draw Him into our lives. He does it all, and yet He's given us, because we're in a sense co-creators, He's given us the obligation, the responsibility to draw that. He won't give it to us on a platter. The more we act as masters, the more we go through this world as yogis, not boastfully, not showing off to anybody else, but living in that strength within ourselves, knowing that we have the position as sons, as daughters of the Infinite, and that we have a claim on Him that any master has ever had. The masters have not come into this world to show us how great they were. They come into this world to show us our potential. What they did, we will be able to do. If not today, if not tomorrow, if not in this life, we'll be able to. Live in the thought that you are free right now, and you will become free. All those millions of incarnations won't exist anymore if you turn on the light and if you live in that light. So let me conclude by singing a song, a poem that Master was given by St. Francis, and I put it to music. And then I'll ask you if you have any questions that you might like to ask. The spiral stairways of wakefulness, I will whisper, whisper, God, God, God. Thou art the food, and when I break my fast of nightly separation from Thee, I will taste Thee and mentally say, God, God, God. No matter where I go, the spotlight of my mind will ever keep turning on Thee. And in the battle din of activity, my silent war cry will be, God, God, God. When boisterous storms of trials shriek, and when worries howl at me, I will drown their noises, loudly chanting, God, God, God. Every night in time of deepest sleep, when my peace dreams and calls joy, joy, my joy comes singing evermore. Of memories, on that magic cloth will I emboss, God, God, God. In waking, eating, working, dreaming, sleeping, serving, chanting, divinely loving, my soul will constantly hum